Hi, this is Brandon Collins here. We're going to talk a little bit about the golf swing today. So as you can see, the golf swing is a pretty complex form of movements. There's a lot of different muscles and motions that are involved. Picture one, and you see the top left corner over there, would be considered the setup. Picture with two through three, or 2 through 4, would be considered the backswing, and then the remaining pictures would be considered the downswing. So each motion has a little bit of different movements that are occurring during that time. So during the setup, you can see he has an anterior pelvic tilt, a slight knee flexion on both knees. You got trunk flexion, you have rounded shoulders, cervical flexion, scapular protraction, shoulder horizontal adduction with flexion, and elbow extension. So as you can see, you hit pretty much every muscle group from your lower extremities up to the top of your head. During the backswing, you see horizontal adduction through whatever side. So if you're a left-handed golfer, you would see the horizontal adduction from the opposite of the images portrayed here. You see lateral trunk rotation on the right or left, depending on your swing, like I said earlier, and then internal rotation of the front hip. And then on the downswing, you see horizontal adduction, lateral trunk rotation, depending on the swing again, and internal rotation of the back hip. So some of the muscles that are involved during this process. Before we get to the muscles, actually, I want to talk about just the gravity positions during these swings. So in the initial part, so the backswing, you're going against gravity. So pictures 2, 3, and 4, you see the backswing, you're going against gravity. And when you go from the downswing, so the remaining pictures, you're swinging with gravity assisting you on the downswing. Until the follow through, you see that you're working again against gravity, but the swing's complete at that point. You've already hit the ball. But just to complete that full motion, you're going against gravity. So the primary muscles that are involved, like I said, there's a lot of muscles that are involved. So for the anterior pelvic tilt, you have the hip flexors and spinal extensors. For knee flexion, you have the hamstrings primarily. For the trunk flexors, you have the rectus abdominis and the obliques, internal and external, both contribute to that trunk flexion. For cervical flexion, you see at setup, the primary muscle would be the sternocleidomastoid. For horizontal adduction, you see the pectoralis major as your primary muscle. For shoulder flexion, you have the pectoralis major. Primarily the upper fibers work for shoulder flexion within the first 0 to 60 degrees. For elbow extension, you see that the triceps are the longest, or are the primary movers. And lateral trunk rotation, you see the obliques, internal and external, like I said before, and then the transverso spinalis muscle groups, so the multifidus, the rotators, and the spinalis. And then for hip rotation, you see the obturator externus and internus, and for external rotation. And for internal rotation, it's primarily the gluteus minimus. Okay, so different contractions, I didn't go through all of them, but for more of the primary ones, so for hip flexion, you see a concentric contraction, and for spinal extension, so with that anterior pelvic tilt, you also see a concentric contraction. For knee flexion, you see a concentric contraction during the setup, and eccentric during the backswing and downswing. For trunk flexion, you see concentric during the setup and eccentric finishing during the downswing. For contraction of the serratus anterior, you would see a concentric contraction, and for cervical flexion, you would also see at that initial setup, you'd see a concentric contraction during that initial setup. But you also, like I said, with the setup, you can see a cervical concentric contraction. And then as you look up to finish to the full swing, you go into more of an extension, so you're actually eccentrically contracting during the downswing finish. So for some of the force couples, for the external rotation that you see at the hip, you have the deep 6 external rotators that are pulling medially from the greater trochanter, except if you're piriformis, it's a little bit superior medially line of pull. You have the iliopsoas and sartorius, and the pull is superior and medially, and the glute max pulls medially from the femur. So all three of these motions, or all of these three contractions combined, can produce that external rotation that you see at the hip during the backswing. And then just some exercises to help strengthen. Really, you could probably strengthen almost every muscle group as far as from the feet upwards, but just to focus on a few, that anterior pelvic tilt, so your spinal extensors, in your hip flexors. If you can just get into that anterior pelvic tilt and hold it, you can also do leg raises to get the spine or the hip flexors, single leg raises. For spinal extension, the Superman pose is a great strengthening exercise. For abdominal rotation, you can do ball throws against a trampoline. You can do kind of the ab rotation exercises where you have a weight, knees are bent, and then going left and right to get all the rotators. That's another strengthening exercise, and you really do need that strong. You really need a really strong core and a really strong obliques to really make that turn and hold that position, so you can grade a lot more power through your golf swing. For the abduction that you see and the adduction, you can just do lateral shoulder raises to get them in the adduction and back to neutral, back to midline to get adduction, so that abduction is coming out and adduction is coming back in. And then for stretching, just because you're in that anterior pelvic tilt position, you really want to stretch those hip flexors and the spinal extensors. You'll feel from golfing too much, as I have, I can definitely feel a lot of pain, soreness in my lower back. My hamstrings, you get really tight from being in that knee flex position, so you want to stretch your hamstrings as well. And then any of the external internal obliques or the transverso spinalis muscles that help with rotation, you want to stretch really in both planes of rotation, because most of your movement comes through that rotation, as well as that anterior pelvic tilt. Because you have to hold that for most of the golf swing. So if you stretch those out, you should swing more freely and not be in as much pain. I hope this will help. This is my interpretation of the golf swing, and thank you for listening. There's emotions that go through each different part of the golf swing. So during the setup, you've got an anterior pelvic tilt, you got slight knee flexion, you got trunk flexion, you got some rounded shoulders, cervical flexion, you got scapular protraction, shoulder horizontal adduction with flexion, and elbow extension. So if you look back to the pictures,